So I just want to kind of paint the picture as to what we're going to go through today. Firstly, I'd like to articulate the concept of a BEE cycle and just define what we mean with the BEE cycle and why it is important that we identify a BEE cycle. Secondly, we're going to go through the components that support a BEE cycle. And those components, we're going to run through planning, we're going to run through implementation, monitoring and verification. And we could see them as stages, but the reason we talk about components is that they don't necessarily follow on one another. They also overlap, and we'll talk through that. And then lastly, we want to reflect and say to ourselves, let's understand our challenges in our roles, whether that's a transformation manager, so that we can identify where we may be weak and where we may need to beef up and support one of these different components in order to achieve our BEE objectives, and particularly the scorecard objectives. So talking to the BEE cycle, well, I've got a linear line here, a timeline matched to your financial year. And when we look at the scorecard, we accumulate BEE transactions over the financial year that culminate in your BEE scorecard. And some of the elements happen in the financial year, and they've got to happen in the financial year to be recorded and recognized on the scorecard. And they relate to skills development, procurement, supplier development, enterprise development, and socioeconomic development. And then we've got certain elements that happen after the financial year, being your ownership, management, control, employment, equity. And if we look at the components of support during your BEE cycle, the first component is that we need to plan. And it even starts before the start of your financial year, which is when you're setting your budgets. So during the budget setting process in the previous financial year, we need to say, okay, how much do we think we're going to need for skills development? How much are we going to need for enterprise development and socioeconomic development? And we need to get that into our budgets so that we can spend it in the financial year, and that there's no additional requests or confusion, but that the required amounts are available from the start. And that forms part of our planning session or component. But with a plan, we also mean we need to look at a transformation strategy, and we need to look at a scorecard plan. And we differentiate between the two of those. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that, but a scorecard plan talks to what do I need to do to get a score on the scorecard. So what do I need to put into the scorecard so that I get points? And we need to plan that. Secondly, we need to implement our plan as the second component. And then we need to monitor where are we in our journey so that we can make changes and correct our direction. And lastly, we go through a verification process whereby we need to evidence what we've done in order to get a certification of our state of transformation or our BEE level. So the BEE cycle starts when you start thinking about your next certificate. For instance, your budgeting process. The transactions start accumulating at the start of your financial year, but the cycle only ends after your certificate is issued, when best practice is to do a debrief in order to correct and in order to improve your full cycle and the support that you get throughout that cycle. So we look at the four components, being the planning, the implementation, monitoring, and verification support. We look at that similar to a table with four legs or four components. If a table misses any of these legs, it's going to be unstable. And we therefore see these four components as crucial to stabilizing your BE status or your level, and also achieving your desired level. So if we look at our BE level and we look at the activities that are there to support us, I'm going to talk about we, which is collectively the measured entity, the transformation manager, the transformation team, the consultant, as well as the verification agency, that need to be coordinated and need to work together. And yes, we need to keep the verification agency independent and honest. But the activities that we go through, firstly, is to look at whether we have a transformation strategy. If we have one, do we need to refresh it? And we also then prepare our scorecard plan, whereby we identify the quantum of initiatives that we need to execute. We then look at the implementation activities, and good practice is to develop an implementation plan, ideally in Gantt format. We would then, as we go through the implementation, do interim validation of the, let me call it, transactions that we have executed, and also the underlying supporting evidence that would enable certification of those transactions. And we would then compute or do a scorecard computation. And I just want to differentiate between running a scorecard computation and doing a scorecard assessment. The assessment of a scorecard means that we look at what is going into the scorecard. So we validate what goes in order to get a verifiable score that ends up in the scorecard. Once an interim scorecard is done, one reviews the findings and one updates the scorecard plan. So one readjusts your quantum, i.e. your required contributions. You may at this stage have a better idea of what your forecast revenue and net profit after tax will be. So you can readjust your targets and your contributions values for enterprise, supply, and socioeconomic development. But you can also identify exactly what are the actions that I now need to take at this interim stage and that I need to take before the financial year end in order to achieve our desired level. One would then go into a further implementation of these actions, then calculate and validate a year-end scorecard. And the importance of this is so that we know where we think we're going to end up. And we can see that when we've now gone into verification and the verification agency has an initial unverified score, we should be on the same page. The next activity is to engage the verification agency, to do the kickoff meeting, which is an important step, then to review what you're going to be presenting to the verification agency, followed by support in terms of the verification process, any technical support required, and once a provisional report is issued, to review that report, and then also at the end of, after the certificate is issued, to do a thorough debrief in order to improve this entire process and the activities that we go through in order to support our BE level. So the different components of the BE cycle, talking about the first component being your planning or your strategy, there's a saying that goes, if you don't know where you're going to end up somewhere else. And that rings very true for doing your BE cycle or working towards a certain BE level. If you're not planning for where you want to get to, like, for instance, doing a roadmap and you're heading for a certain destination, you may not get to where you want to be. And another saying that comes to mind is to plan your work and then to work your plan. And the reality never turns out exactly like your plan, but in the least, if we've got a plan, we've got direction, we know what to do, and we can adjust as we go along. Looking at this diagram, I'm looking at the interaction between the different kind of elements, and the transformation strategy a larger it's a larger strategy that looks at impact. It's aligned to business strategy, but it encompasses a scorecard plan. So your scorecard plan is what I put into the scorecard in terms of the different elements. And those elements also drive what government sees as the transformation that they would like to achieve. And an organization's own transformation strategy looks at how do we leverage that scorecard plan in order to have the desired impact from a transformative perspective that we would like to see in society. The baseline scorecard could be based either on your previous year's scorecard, or it could be based on an interim scorecard. And that baseline scorecard informs what your scorecard plan is. So for instance, we would know, okay, at the moment we at a level 4, we want to be a level 3 or 2, and we would understand what the initiatives are that we are doing, and therefore identify the quantums and any further initiatives that need to be designed and implemented. And very important, once again, is that we do validate what goes into that scorecard. So if we put garbage into our scorecard or our calculator, we're going to get garbage out. In other words, we could think that we've got 100 points, but come the verification, a lot of evidencing document is not available, and we end up with only 45 points as an example. So very important is throughout your cycle to build up and stack up the evidence, put it into your system, make sure it's filed, it's available, and that you indeed are looking at a certifiable and verifiable score when you look at your monitoring and your scorecards. So the transformation strategy should be reviewed on a regular or on an annual basis and adjusted to where the company is going and also your transformative objectives. And the transformation strategy would be aligned to your business strategy and your business objectives in order to support the achievement of those objectives. Secondly, it would consider what is the impact we would like to achieve, and the impact could be written as a story, starting with the end in mind. So in other words, you may want to tell your transformation story around the business, around your services, or around the product that you deliver, in order to also get the marketing leverage on that story. And then you would like to integrate your strategy into your management system. In other words, your organizational structure, who's accountable, and also to set KPIs against certain activities and objectives, so that the driving of your strategy is organic in terms of integrated into the system, and it drives itself. So once we have a scorecard plan, we then need to prepare an implementation plan, ideally in a Gantt format, which would then say, okay, who's doing what by when? And the difference between an implementation plan and a scorecard plan is that the scorecard plan looks at what are your initiatives and how much are you going to do, where the implementation plan looks at the activities and how do we roll that scorecard into a reality. So when we do the planning, we firstly, and in deciding what type of initiatives we are doing, we need to say, why am I doing this? Am I doing it for scorecard points and or transformative impact? And we need to clearly understand what are the objectives of what we want to achieve, and therefore know the why. The next question is, what do I do? What am I going to do? And we would want to identify recognizable initiatives. So these initiatives should be aligned to the B-BBEE codes. They should be validated, and we need to know that we will get the points from them. And the initiatives should be practical. They should be implementable. They should be effective. We would want to have impact through that initiatives. and they want to be not very labor intensive. So they don't want to take a lot of time from management in order to design and implement. The next step is, well, how much do I need to do? So we need to quantify what is it we want to do, how much do we want to do, and then very importantly is we need to calibrate our calculation. So in other words, is our understanding of the calculation methodology the same understanding that the verification agency has? And this is in order to eliminate that we get to the verification stage, we get to the certificate, and we have contributed too little because we didn't understand the calculation. So these are all considerations and questions we need to ask during the planning stage. So talking about the difference between a scorecard plan and a transformation strategy. Firstly, a scorecard plan looks at what do we put in. So how much do we contribute? And we're thinking about the quantum and the design of an initiative, and it focuses on scorecard points. So how much do we need to do to get a certain BE level? The transformation strategy, on the other hand, is built around a scorecard plan. So if we like, the scorecard plan could be your backbone, and the transformation is the flesh around the backbone. The transformation strategy focuses on your impact. What is your transformative impact in society and your stakeholders? Which is slightly different to saying, how much do I put into a scorecard? The transformation strategy should support your business strategy and objectives. In order to support it, it needs to be aligned. So through designing the strategy, we need to say, let's understand the business. Let's understand the business strategy and objectives. And therefore, let's think about initiatives that can support this and the achievement of these objectives. And then lastly, we want to integrate it into the system, into the management system. We want to motivate the owners of the different elements or areas through KPIs. We want to assign accountability and responsibility. I think there's nothing like accountability to drive the achievement of certain goals. The features of a transformation strategy is that it's aligned to the business objectives. It thinks about and it considers what are your stakeholder expectations. An example being to have an ICASA license. What is the level of black ownership that I need in terms of the licensing requirement? In the fishing industry, what are the requirements in order for me to get my quota or to get a bigger quota of fishing rights? What are my customers' expectations? What are the communications we get? What contractual obligations do I have? Maybe I've got a contract which says you've got to be a level 3. If you drop to a level 4, you've got a penalty of X. So very important to understand those expectations. Also good to know where you stand compared to your competitors. So to do a competitor analysis. And that's not only important to maintaining your business, but also to growing your business. Your strategy should be practical. So you don't want a bicycle with too many gears because it's confusing and you may not be able to ride it. You rather want something that is implementable and that we can achieve the impact. And the impact we would like to be measurable so that we can talk to that impact that we've achieved. The strategy should lead to business benefits, not only scorecard benefits, and we should look at creating shared value. So in other words, value to society whilst we are creating value to the business. The process of developing a transformation strategy should firstly look at contextualization. So what is the context of the business? We need to know how we're going to govern it. We want to know what our objectives are. The next thing is to understand our baseline. So to know which scorecard are we using at the base, what are our current existing initiatives, understand the competitors, understand the perceptions and the requirements and expectations. The next step is to look at transformation objectives in alignment to business objectives to understand what drives success in the company. Are we driving revenue? Are we driving intellectual capital or human capital? Understanding material sustainability issues and to then define what are our objectives in terms of our transformation. The next step would be to identify various options. So what are the different things we can do? And then to take these options, build them into a path and see how we are going to build our BE level and the impact we want to achieve over a period of time. And lastly is formulating and articulating the strategy so that we can position it in public if we wish to, positioning it to leadership so that it's well articulated and we can create our transformation story. In terms of the implementation component, this is the part where we work our plan. So we've gone through the planning, but now we've got to execute and implement our plan. A Gantt chart helps us to say, what are we going to do? Who's responsible and accountable? And by when are we going to do this? And typically your Gantt chart would be rather detailed with all your activities throughout the BE cycle. We would look at a governance structure. So who's accountable? So this would be an organogram that shows us who's dealing with which element or who's overall responsible and what are the organizational platforms that we're going to be using. Like, for instance, a transformation committee meeting with a set agenda where we typically cover certain set items. For instance, we could have on that our current scorecard as per our latest calculation, identified actions, next steps, remedial actions required, further budget required, as an example of agenda items. And it's important that we can early on identify issues and we can escalate these issues for corrective action or for further authority to push through any barriers or obstacles we have. And then we also need to manage our service providers, including the verification agency. So we may have consultants, advisors, we need to coordinate. We need to coordinate the timing of the BE verification. We need to look at our learnership service providers, coordinate the timing of when we engage on these learnerships in order to achieve the absorption timing. So there's quite a bit of coordination that should be done as part of the implementation process. And then also part of this is to set the KPIs and to monitor and measure against the KPIs. This is an example of a Gantt chart, and you'll see it's quite detailed. We've got the planning stage and the different activities within each of these stages. The responsible person, there could be a percentage of completion around this, start date, end date, and then a graphical calendar illustration of when what is happening. And we should do this for every aspect of the BE cycle and of the areas of support that we need to provide. In terms of monitoring, firstly, we should look at our information system. And this information system it doesn't need to be complicated, but it needs to work. It could be a software that we have as part of the information system. That could be web-based, it could be a spreadsheet, but there are certain areas of this that we need to make sure is correct. And if we think of a BE verification, the verification process is designed to count what you present and to validate what you present. It isn't designed to make sure that you've tabled everything that you can put into the scorecard. So your system also needs to look at objectives like the completeness. It needs to make sure that your information is accurate and that it is valid, so that your anticipated score doesn't fall flat when you get to the verification and certification stage. So this process would look at periodic scorecard assessments, and that scorecard assessment could be quarterly, or it could be half year, or it could be any other stage. And the importance of the timing of this assessment is that you want to do it soon enough or long enough before the financial year end, so that you can identify what you need to do before the financial year end, and so that you've got enough time to go and execute on those identified actions. But you also want to do it long enough after the start of your financial year, so that you actually have the initiatives and the transactions that have been implemented for you to measure and to validate. The next step is to look at your scorecard and to evaluate and to assess where you are, and to interpret that scorecard, to make sure that you understand what are the numbers telling me. And if they are telling you something, you need to respond to that and revisit your scorecard plan and update your scorecard plan and your actions to redirect, let's say, your compass to north and achieve what you want to achieve. So that could be, for instance, where you need to revisit your forecast revenue, your forecast net profit after tax, work out your different targets, and to say, okay, I was planning to spend so much on enterprise development as an example. I now need to spend more. I don't have budget for it, so I need to do a budget application, or I need to go through a process to get that additional required amount authorized. And you may also go through a process to say, okay, but we're now heading for a level 5. We were planning a level 4. Maybe a 5 is okay. Maybe I don't need to go and implement further actions. The next step is to update your implementation plan, and then to implement and to action what you need to do and what you've decided to do in your updated scorecard plan. As we go along, we should gather evidence, and this evidence should be gathered during the course of these transactions. It's not good practice to come to the end of the year and let's say you only do your verification in June, to only try and gather your evidence and your supporting documents after the financial year end. Best practice is to, before you make a contribution, to make sure that you have the right documentation already received from your transacting partner. So that could be your beneficiary, or the person or the skills program you're running. As an example, your procurement side. So before making payments, in your process, have a check to say, okay, do I have the latest BE certificate? Check it on the system. If you don't have it, you can initiate a request from that supplier. Another example is when you're doing your socioeconomic development contribution, to make sure that I've got the maybe an independent competent persons report. I've got a description of the initiative. I know that initiative qualifies, so I've got the documentation. I've got a draft confirmation of receipt of benefit letter. And by the time I do the transaction, I can package it and it's already recognizable. Once that is done, we update the scorecard and monitor that scorecard to say, okay, we've now gone through a process. We're coming towards the end of the year. I know where I am. It is where I want to get to. And I have assurance that whatever I put into my scorecard is validated. I have the supporting documents, and I'm confident that my certification will come through. Success factors around our information system. And just to clarify, information system being processes as well as a calculator. So it starts with where the information is initiated, and it ends up in a report or a certificate. So firstly, our system should be calibrated. We need to come to the right answer and the same answer as the verification agency comes to. We may be using different calculators, or in all likelihood it would be different calculators, but our interpretation of shorter payment period recognition must be the same interpretation as the verification agency. And important is that we understand where are the gray areas in the codes, so that we know where to focus on. You may be on a different sector code, and you may be thinking about your absorption. And because the latest absorption legislation talks to the generic codes, some codes are silent. So there's different rules for different sector codes when it comes to an item such as absorption, and that you identify these and make sure that you're on the same page with a verification agency. Another success factor in terms of your information systems is that the operators of the processes and the system need to be informed. So I need to know, as the transformation manager, I need to know of any new legislation. Now that could be a big document of 100 pages. Maybe it's the financial sector code revision that's coming up probably this year, or it could be the new property sector code. I need to know about that. I need to know when it's effective, and I need to know what's in it, what is going to impact me. Now, it doesn't mean I need to go and read the whole thing, but I need to have someone that can interpret and translate that for me, and someone that informs me of when it's happening. The next thing is the interpretation of that. I need to understand new interpretations of verification agencies. I think an example, there was a court case recently with a particular ruling around financial year-ends and measured periods. So I need to understand how are the verification agencies interpreting that. New interpretations, and that could also come from SANAS non-conformances. So verification agency annually goes through an accreditation process. They go through a review, and SANAS would identify areas where they've gone wrong and what they need to fix, and that may impact on us. So therefore, it's important that we talk to the verification agency. On the other hand, it's important that the verification agency informs their clients of any changes. Another success factor is that our system and our process needs to be operated. In order to be operated, we need to assign a responsibility. We often see clients that have big systems, computer calculators, maybe web-based, but no one understands how to operate it and how to drive it. And that gives incorrect scores, or we simply just not utilizing our resources that are available. We could integrate our systems into other systems. For instance, we could integrate into our procurement system. So our calculator could be integrated to our procurement system to give us a real-time procurement score, and we can measure that. It could be integrated into employment equity or human resources master files, so that we've got a real-time initial idea of where we stand. Also important is to limit manual intervention and further to manage whatever manual intervention there is. And an example of that is where we extract information from a system, we dump it into Excel, and now we need to reformat it or reorganize it in order to put it into our calculator. And we should make sure that we manage this intervention and that we do checks to make sure that the data indeed find its way correctly. Further, we should build controls into this information system and also into our processes to ensure that the answer comes out as complete. So we've picked up everything that should go in and into the scorecard, that it is accurate, that it's correctly calculated, so any manual intervention or reorganization of data has been done correctly, and that it's valid, that it is supported. So our controls could be detective or preventative. The preventative controls are more effective. So just to clarify what I mean by this, a detective control picks up an error after it's happened, and the error needs to be corrected, both that instance of error, but also that category of error. So let's think of a plant, a factory that makes Coke bottles, and there's a machine that puts the lid on every Coke bottle. So there may be the one Coke bottle that's the lid is skew, and our audit picks it up, but that machine was broken for the whole day. So we've got to go and identify that entire population that was affected by the error, and that would be a detective control process. A preventative control process is a control that makes sure that we don't have an error in the first place. And if we look at the type of controls, they could be the review. So that could be the review of your scorecard report that comes out of your calculator. It could be the training of your operators to make sure that our operators understand interpretation, they understand what they're doing, they understand why they're doing it, and the importance of what they're doing. The control could be an authorization. So this could be your person sitting in creditors that now needs to, well, let's take a different example. It is someone that needs to issue a purchase order, and they need to issue a purchase order for the procurement of a service. So this person needs to gather a document. They need to know that they need to look at the BE certificate, and they could be instructed to only authorize a procurement or a payment to someone that is a level 4, as an example. So that's a control at the authorization stage. And then reconciliation could, for instance, be where we've now got our BE report that comes out of the information system, and the report says we've got 2,000 people, and we do a reconciliation to the human resources master file, employee master file, and that tells me I've got 2,050 people. So that reconciliation tells us there's a problem. The same could be done with procurement spend or with skills development spend, where we could reconcile back to our ledgers, and we would expect a certain number and maybe a certain variance. But that would pick up that the data that went into our score and into our calculator system could be incorrect. So if we look at a transaction and how a transaction takes place, the first step is that a transaction is initiated. And by transaction, I mean any transaction. This could be something that culminates in a socioeconomic development contribution. It's got a scorecard, BE scorecard impact, but it starts somewhere in the organization. It could also be a simple procurement transaction, but it could also be the appointment of a new employee. It's firstly initiated. We then should be designing what this transaction looks like. As an example, it could be a certain position that's available, and we know we want a certain race and gender person and certain expertise. So we would design what we need. And at that stage, we should think, what is the BE implications? So an easy example would be, I want to appoint a senior manager. Let's go and look what is the implications on the BE employment equity scorecard. It could be that I want to make a donation to a certain initiative, and that would mean that I need to understand what is that donation going to result in. Is it going to result into an SED point? The next thing is I need to gather documents, and I need to document this. So I need to know that for a socioeconomic development type contribution, or let's say rather an enterprise development contribution, I want the BE affidavit of the beneficiary. I want an enterprise development agreement. It may be in draft format. I want to have a draft or a draft confirmation of receipt of benefit or thank you letter already drawn up. So I want all these documents together so that when I get to authorization, the person that is trained to do authorization can now go and inspect all those documents, make sure they're together, and this control would result in a valid scorecard item. So next step would be that we execute the transaction. We would need to then record the transaction from the source documents, and we would capture that into our B scorecard system. That would be processed, and we then get a B scorecard report, which we would then review. That review control would then also tell us, has everything been correctly updated, because we would have now created an expectation at the design stage, and did that expectation realize? So when we do the review of the scorecard report and we don't see the anticipated effect, we can go back through this transaction chain to see where something may have gone wrong. Right, and then the last leg of the table is the verification component. So we could have done all of this. We could have planned, we could have implemented, we could have monitored. But if we fall flat with the verification, we will not get our desired and anticipated outcome or BE level. So once again, a saying comes to mind, which is, if you fail to prepare, you should prepare to fail. So the success of a verification is largely contingent on your preparation. How well have you prepared, both for the process, but also in terms of your documentation and your submissions? Important is that we understand the verification process so that we can plan accordingly and that we can coordinate accordingly. So we've just mapped out what the verification process is. They are largely the same for different verification agencies, but we need to make sure that we know by when do we need to be where in order not to disrupt this process. If we look at the support activities around a verification, good practice is that we upfront calculate where we expect to be. So when we go into the verification, we already know that if the verification agency doesn't come up with a level 4, then something has gone wrong. And we can correct that error timelessly. So we would know what to expect. The next activity is to make sure that we are organized. By organized, I mean our internal transformation team, the element owners, as well as the consultants and also the verification agency. We would make sure we understand technical interpretations, that we understand the expectations that the verification has in terms of the underlying documentation that needs to be gathered, and that we then also present these documents correctly and that they are articulated correctly, and that the verification agency understands what we are presenting. So they need to understand a particular transaction, that we have articulated and explained it in the right language that the verification agency would understand. The next step in terms of an activity is to make sure that your provisional certificate corresponds with what your anticipation and your expectation is. And we now also have the opportunity to correct any misinterpretations. To me, a very important aspect of the verification cycle is the debrief process. So here we would involve the consultant, we'd involve the verification agency, the transformation team, and we would aim for continued improvement. We would identify the issues that have arose. We do a root cause analysis, correct those issues in order to get our information process, our information systems, and our verification process improved year on year. So the success factors for a verification is firstly to have a good kickoff. And if we think of a rugby match, that start is very important, that you start on the right foot, on the front foot. And that means we need to understand the verification process. So in the kickoff stage, let's understand what we are going to go through. Let's understand interpretations, both technical interpretations. So how do we translate the legislation? And secondly, also evidencing interpretations. And then very important is to firstly understand timelines and deadlines. What do they mean? Secondly, to agree on these. And thirdly, that we diarize it and that we share those deadlines and everybody knows what is expected by when. Further success factors is to be organized and to get things right the first time. If we submit information in drips and drabs, the verification agency needs to weave through a number of emails and documents get lost, and yes, I did submit it, no, you didn't. So we get that ineffectiveness if we do not submit in one time. An important success factor is to, as we go along in preparation, to organize our supporting evidence, to file this supporting evidence, to name it correctly, and to make sure that it is the right supporting evidence, so that at the end of the day, we have a file with identifiable supporting evidence that the verification agency can easily understand. So it's a little bit like feeding a baby with a spoon. The easier we make it understandable or to be understood by the verification agency, the easier it's going to be digested and the easier it will translate into the right points. The next thing is to stay with the program. Once we miss a timeline or a deadline, we now need to make another meeting, and the verification analyst already has a full diary, so we can only do it in a week's time. So now we lose focus and the whole process prolongs and we could miss our issue date. So very important is to meet those deadlines. And then coordination and calibration of the interpretations and evidencing. And then once again, the debrief aspect. So let's reflect on all of this. And I think probably the most important thing today is to ask ourselves, do we understand our own challenges and the areas that we could be weak or need support? Do we have access to knowledge and technical developments? So are we being informed? Do I have a process in place? Do I have the right people that are informing me? Do I have sufficient focus on BEE? Am I too focused on my core activities? And BEE is seen as an add-on and it's non-core and therefore it's neglected. Is that a challenge that I have? Do I have the wrong competence? And I think it's, no one wants to say, okay, I'm not competent. But do I really have the right technical knowledge? And this may not be due to me, it could be due to the complexity of legislation and also the rate at which legislation changes and the rate at which technical interpretations of the existing legislation changes. And do I have the right experience? Am I independent and objective? So am I not seeing my own mistakes? Do I have sufficient objectivity and independence when looking at my processes, looking at the answers that come out? And do I have capacity? Am I getting to this, or do I need further resources? So if we look at what are the benefits and what is in it for me if I get this process right, if I make sure that I have these components in place, all of the components. Firstly, you would maintain or you would improve your BEE status. You'd achieve your required status. You would have accurate verification, a streamlined process. You would save time. You can focus on core business where you make the money, and you could be coordinated. Now, what would I avoid if I focus on these particular components in the cycle? I would avoid a surprise. I would avoid a bad BE level or a disappointing level and the resulting loss of business or opportunities. I wouldn't waste time. I would avoid any unnecessary cost or the inability to focus on what I should be focusing on, and I would reduce any frustrations that I may have. So I don't.
Thank you for a insightful webinar, Eric.
Thanks, everyone.